the body and blood of Jesus given for you. We hear this phrase in every divine service. How often do we stop to think about what it really means? What does it mean to give your body and blood? In this week's session, we're going to engage with the prophecy of the suffering servant, laid out in the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. Borrowing from Handel's method in the renowned Messiah Oratorio, we'll explore each verse individually to find a deeper meaning. If you have a Bible, please follow along. The first 3 verses of Isaiah 53 focus on how the suffering of the servant was misunderstood by those that observed it. Let's read the first 2 verses. Who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no stately form or splendor, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. The arm of the Lord, or the help and power of God's presence, is spoken of several times in the book of Isaiah. In this verse, we can understand that Isaiah is speaking of a future time after the arm of the Lord has arrived, in the form of the servant, to save his people. The questions that begin this chapter make it clear that those around him did not realize it, and the next verse tells us why. The servant didn't seem to be anything special. He was a mere man, and not an outstanding one based on his looks. So he was met with indifference. Verse 3 takes these misunderstandings a step further. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. The word despise is used twice in this verse, which emphasizes that the servant was not only misunderstood, but was even detested and looked at with contempt. And in hiding their faces, far from following him, they shunned him. The word esteem in this verse is actually an accounting word, a reckoning of value. The last line of verse 3 drives home the point that when appraised by the people who saw him, the servant had no value in their eyes. Therefore, his suffering was without worth. Verses 4 through 6 explain the previous verses. They tell us why the servant suffered for the sin of mankind. Let's start with verse 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Yes, the servant was a man of sorrows, but they were not his own. They were ours. Another meaning for the word smitten is struck down, humiliated. This line exposes that those who saw his suffering assumed that it was from God, and therefore rightfully deserved. The next verse, however, reveals the truth. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. The servant suffered for our sin. His sacrifice was a substitute for our punishment, and through his pain and wounds, our alienation from God was healed and restored. At some moment this week, read these verses again and take the time to see the rawness and pain that the author so poetically expresses. The words give a picture of real and horrible suffering that should not be lost to us. Let's read verse 6. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned, every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The image of the sheep emphasizes our human nature and inadequacy. Like one of our hymns reminds us, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. The author also emphasizes the common guilt of humanity and our individual sinfulness by starting with the word all, and then in the next line using every one to his own way. We are all to blame for our sin. The word iniquity, used repeatedly in these verses, is more than just another term for sin. At its root, it implies crookedness or bentness and reflects the distortion of humanity by sin. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This was a divine act. The servant was the plan and provision of God for our sin. He was the satisfaction for our punishment, and his suffering fulfilled God's will. These last 3 verses stress that the servant was alone in his suffering, and ultimately in his death. Verses 7 through 9 describe the servant's voluntary and undeserved death. Even though he did not deserve to die, he died willingly. Let's start with verses 7 and 8. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. In silence, the servant endured his suffering and died. He is compared to a lamb being taken to slaughter. However, an animal does not know consciously what is happening, unlike the servant who is not ignorant and still goes willingly. The idea of a substitutionary sacrifice was quite a departure from the rest of the Old Testament, where the people atoned for their sins with the continual animal sacrifices. This prophecy points to a need for a greater sacrifice, where animal substitution is insufficient and where a sin is most serious, when it is willful, when we choose to sin. We know something is wrong, but we do it anyways. Only a consenting will can be a substitute for a rebellious will. So the servant, without sin, acceptable to the holy God, submitted to suffering and death as a once brought, eternally valid sacrifice. And who will declare his generation? The wording is a little difficult, but we can understand that this is a questioning who, if any, of his contemporaries will proclaim that he died for the sin of the people. Again, a reminder that the servant's suffering was misunderstood by those in his time. Let's read our last verse. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Read in the context of the Old Testament, this verse is perplexing. If he was condemned and died with the wicked, the criminals, then he should also be buried with them. This verse is really only comprehensible by its fulfillment in Jesus. And I think this really sums up our contemplation through these 9 verses in Isaiah. When events in Jesus' life provide the explanation for this prophecy, we are certain that he is the suffering servant. He was despised, rejected, crushed, struck down, and killed for our sin and for our reconciliation with God. As we approach Holy Communion this Sunday and in every divine service, let's take the time to contemplate what it meant for him to give his body and blood for our sake, and wonder at how he willingly suffered alone to be the Savior of all. Let this gift of grace carry you through Passiontide.